Good evening. I'm Haylee Ficuciello, and this is your Englebrook Independent News Federal Crime Report, your direct look at major federal investigations, prosecutions, and sentencing development across the southern east United States. Tonight, federal authorities disrupt an Iranian cyber operation, a multi-million-dollar fraud scheme out of Maryland, a cartel-linked weapon trafficking, and a sweeping series of drugs, fraud, and violent crimes across 9 states. We begin tonight in Maryland. The Justice Department has seized 4 internet domains tied to Iran Ministry of Intelligence and Security, known as MOIS. Federal officials say the domains were used to conduct cyber-enabled psychological operations, claiming responsibility for hacking attacks, release stolen data, and in some cases calling for violence against journalism, dissidents, and Israeli individuals. One of those domains is linked to the March 2026 destructive malware attack targeting the US-based medical technology company. Investigators say the operation highlights a growing threat where foreign intelligence agencies use cyber tools to influence, intimidate, and destabilize. In Baltimore, a 31-year-old man has been sentenced to 6 years in federal prison for his role in nearly $3 million money laundering conspiracy. Prosecutors say Gordon Aboglan used a shell company and stole identities to open bank accounts, receiving funds from business emails comprised scams. Victims believe they were paying legitimate vendors, when in reality, the money were being redirected into fraudulent accounts. The scheme ran from 2021 through 2023 and is tied to 14 individuals. Aboglan has been ordered to pay nearly $2.94 million in restitution. A Maryland-based healthcare group has agreed to pay $4 million to resolve federal allegations for billing a medically unnecessary procedures. According to investigators, the company submitted claims to Medicare, Medicaid, and Tricare for vein treatments that were not clinically justified. Officials say the cases underscore continued federal enforcement against healthcare fraud and abuse of taxpayer programs. From Maryland, we move to West Virginia. A cemetery owner has pled guilty to wire fraud after taking money intended for grave markers and using it for personal expenses. Federal prosecutors say Jeffrey Fraze accepted payments from families, approved design, and then repeatedly delayed delivery, misleading victims while keeping their funds. Losses are estimated between $250,000 and $550,000. A former business owner has admitted to fraudulently obtaining nearly $300,000 in pandemic relief funds. Authorities say Bradley Temple falsified business information to secure federal loans, then used the money for personal purchases. He faces up to 10 years in prison. A Detroit man has been sentenced to more than 6 years in prison for supplying methamphetamine and fentanyl in West Virginia. Officials say the drugs were distributed throughout Harrison County. Now to Virginia, where federal prosecutors are targeting international weapon trafficking tied to cartel operation. A Bulgarian armed trafficker extradited from Spain is now facing federal charges in Virginia. Prosecutors allege that the defendant conspired to supply military-grade weapons, including machine guns, rocket launchers, and anti-aircraft systems, to Mexican cartels known as CJNG. Authorities say the weapons were intended to support cocaine trafficking operations in the United States. If convicted, the defendant faces up to life in prison. In Norfolk, a convicted felon has been sentenced to 7 years in prison for distributing cocaine and illegally possessing a firearm. Investigators recovered drugs, weapons, and ammunition from multiple locations. 2 men have been sentenced to 18 and 19 years in prison for a violent armed robbery of vape shops. Victims were assaulted, restrained, and robbed at gunpoint during the incident. Next, North Carolina. A Fayetteville man has been sentenced to 35 years in federal prison for leading a decade-long drug trafficking operation. Authorities say the organization distributed massive quantities of methamphetamine, fentanyl, heroin, and cocaine. Investigators estimated over 350 pounds of methamphetamine alone when trafficked. Now to Tennessee, a Mississippi man has been sentenced to 9 years in prison for a violent carjacking. Authorities say he pointed a rifle at a victim and stole her vehicle before being arrested the next day. 3 women have been convicted of wire fraud involving altered medical prescriptions submitted to healthcare programs. Prosecutors say the scheme involved unauthorized use of provider identities to obtain payments. Now to South Carolina, a Colombian man has been sentenced to more than 24 years in prison for selling drugs, firearms, and weapons modified with Glock switches converting into machine guns. Some of the firearms were linked to violent crimes. A Lexington man has been pled guilty to firearm and drug trafficking charges following a police response to report of hostage situation. Authorities recovered weapons, drugs, and cash. Next, Georgia. Multiple defendants faced federal charges in Georgia, including robbery, drug trafficking, and illegal possessions of machine guns. Several individuals also face charges for illegally re-entering the United States after deportation. A Georgia man has been sentenced to 70 months in prison after making threats against federal employees and their families. Now to Florida, a convicted felon has pled guilty to trafficking fentanyl and possession of a firearm after authorities intercepted a package containing more than 300 grams of drugs. He faces a minimum of 10 years in prison. An inmate has pled guilty to distributing and receiving child exploitation material using a prison-issued tablet. Investigators recovered hundreds of illegal images. Another defendant has been sentenced to 7 years in prison for running a large-scale marijuana and THC distribution operation. And finally, Mississippi. Two separate drug trafficking cases have resulted in federal prison sentencing. One defendant received nearly 4 years after being found with methamphetamine during a traffic stop. Another one was sentenced to 10 years for distributing large quantities of narcotics. From foreign cyber operations to cartel-linked weapon trafficking to drug networks, fraud schemes, and violent crimes across American communities, federal authorities say the cases reflect scale and complexity of threats facing the nation today. For continued coverage, stay with Englebrook Independent News. I'm Haylee Ficuciello. Good night.